In this lecture, we'll look at attempts to create peace agreements between Israelis and Palestinians, and also other neighboring Middle Eastern states. Outside parties have negotiated peace between Israel and Palestine multiple times since 1948. While marginal progress has been made, each round of peace talks has eventually collapsed and violence between the two groups has resumed. After this lecture, you'll understand why peace treaties have failed between Israel and Palestine time and time again. Over the decades of conflict between Israel and its neighbors following British withdrawal from the region, both sides began to tire of the constant warfare, and a new wave of diplomacy broke out in the 1970s. In 1979, Jimmy Carter managed to broker a peace agreement between Egypt and Israel. Here's a picture between Menachem Begin, Carter, and Anwar al-Sadat at the bottom. This was a major advance. By the terms of the agreement, Egypt became the first nation in the Middle East to formally recognize the State of Israel. In exchange, Israel returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, which it obtained in the 1967 Six-Day War, and this was a remarkably large amount of land to give. It composed 2/3 of Israel's total land holdings and also had oil. So giving this back to Egypt would be the equivalent of California giving all of its land south of Sacramento to Mexico. Some of the terms of the agreement were complete normalization and an ending of the state of war that had existed technically between the two states since 1948. With the complete normalization of relations, borders open, flights began between Israel and Egypt, and Israel and Egypt became important strategic partners in the region. Egypt also demilitarized the Sinai Peninsula after Israel withdrawed, and it made sure that the Straits of Tiran and Aqaba and the Suez Canal were international waterways continuously open to Israel. It was the closing of the Strait of Tiran that originally triggered the 1967 Six-Day War. Also, Israel began to receive Egyptian crude oil. This was an extremely unpopular decision across the Middle East, particularly amongst Palestinians who believed that they had been betrayed. Yasser Arafat called this a false peace that would not last. Egypt did suffer consequences for this peace agreement. Anwar al-Sadat was assassinated in 1981, and Egypt was suspended from the Arab League from 1979 to 1989. Also, as part of this agreement, the U.S. offered foreign aid to Egypt, which, since this treaty, has given over $38 billion over the years. Most people don't know that the number one recipient of foreign aid in the Middle East is not Israel, but Egypt. As a result, these two have been important strategic partners in the region. With this peace agreement, it was an important step forward, and it gave optimism for the first time in decades that peace could be achieved in the Middle East between different factions where the problems appeared to be intractable. But despite the seeming advance, the calls for peace angered extremists on both sides. In addition to Anwar al-Sadat's assassination, diplomacy also took a back seat in 1982 when Israel invaded southern Lebanon in retaliation to the attacks made by homemade rockets that Palestinian refugees were firing over the border into Israeli settlements. Israeli troops occupied this area for 18 years until their withdrawal in 2000. Since then, there have been two periods of intensified Palestinian aggression against Israel. These periods are known as intifadas, which intifada is an Arabic word that means shake off, and it suggests a popular uprising against oppression or an oppressive state. It's resulted in suicide bombings targeted to kill Israeli civilians, which also marks the origin of modern terrorism and the widespread use of suicide bombings that we see frequently throughout the world today, a technique that's just become all too commonplace. The First Intifada took place between 1987 and 1993, and it was as a response to the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories. Fortunately, it ended in 1994 when, as you can see with the picture there, Bill Clinton brokered peace between Yasser Arafat, who is the chairman of the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. But events seesawed back toward war in the Second Intifada of 2000. Following failed peace negotiations at Camp David, in which Yasser Arafat summarily refused any offer given to him, even the entire city of Jerusalem, and normalization of relations between Palestinians, separating the state. Following failed peace negotiations, Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon visited the Temple Mount in Israel. This area is sacred to both Jews and Muslims, as it was the site of the Jewish temple of the Old Testament times. It's also the location of the 8th century Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Temple Mount Mosque, which we saw pictures of earlier, built by the Umayyad Caliphate. During this visit, Sharon declared that the Temple Mount is in our hands and will remain in our hands. It is the holiest site in Judaism and is the right of every Jew to visit the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount today is a heavily contested site, and there are armed guards standing there so both Jews and Muslims can visit, as not allowing one group to visit the Temple Mount would flare up anger even more, but it's a heavily guarded area and loaded with symbolism. As a result of Sharon's statement, it marked the beginning of 5 more years of riots and clashes between Palestinian civilians and the Israeli Defense Force. Peace received another setback in 2006. At this time, the PLO held a vote and elected to its parliament the political party Hamas, which has called for the utter destruction of Israel and has been labeled a terrorist organization by the United States and Europe. However, Israel has responded in kind by trying to isolate and marginalize them internationally. As of this recording in 2014, the Israeli military is currently trying to destroy tunnels buried within the Palestinian-occupied areas that are used to funnel armaments and weapons, and also to carry out attacks against Israel. And there have been numerous rocket attacks fired from the Palestinian side against Israel. Along with this, Israel has tried to build settlements within Palestinian-recognized territories, but then later withdrew them. So again, this is just opening up a whole new chapter in this violent conflict between these two parties. So while there has been momentum in terms of peace agreements over the decades, sadly this bloody status quo continues onward. In the next lecture, we're going to look at the global scale instead of just pinpointing on the Middle East, and look at the rise of global terrorism and Osama bin Laden, the road to 9/11. Thank you for listening.